There's a place in northern Kenya where the bones tell a story that academia tried to ignore for decades. 27 people. Men, women, children. Their skeletons lie exactly where they fell 10,000 years ago, still bearing the marks of unimaginable violence. Hands bound behind backs. Skulls shattered by blunt force. Pregnant women struck down mid-flight. This wasn't war as we understand it. This was something older. Something we've been lying to ourselves about ever since we learned to write our own history. This is the story of Nataruk. And it changes everything we thought we knew about human nature. The year is 2012. A team of archaeologists led by Marta Mirazan-Lar from Cambridge University is working along the southwest shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya. This is harsh country. Scrubland stretches in every direction, broken only by acacia trees and the shimmering heat that makes the horizon dance. The lake itself, once called Lake Rudolph by colonial mapmakers, is the world's largest permanent desert lake, a remnant of much wetter times when this entire region was lush and green. The team isn't looking for anything in particular. They're conducting a survey, cataloging sites, taking notes. Standard archaeological work in a region known for yielding some of humanity's oldest ancestors. Lake Turkana has given us fossils dating back millions of years, evidence of our earliest relatives learning to walk upright, learning to use tools, learning to think. But what they find on this particular afternoon isn't millions of years old. It's recent by archaeological standards. Just 10,000 years. A blink. And yet, what lies in the sediment will force us to reconsider one of the most fundamental questions we've ever asked ourselves: are humans naturally peaceful, corrupted only by the rise of civilization, property, and agriculture? Or has violence always been with us, coded into our very DNA, present even before we built our first permanent settlements? The site is called Nataruk. It's unremarkable from a distance. But as the team begins to excavate, they realize they're standing in the middle of something extraordinary. Something terrible. They're standing in the middle of a massacre. The first evidence of large-scale human-on-human violence that predates civilization itself. Let me take you back 10,000 years. Let me show you what happened here. And let me explain why it matters more than almost any other archaeological discovery of the past century. 10,000 years ago, the world was a different place. We're talking about roughly 8,000 BCE, a time that sits right at the boundary between two epochs, the Pleistocene, which had lasted for over 2.5 million years, and the Holocene, the current geological epoch we still inhabit today. The Ice Age had recently ended. For tens of thousands of years, massive glaciers had covered much of the northern hemisphere. Europe was a frozen wasteland. North America lay buried under ice sheets miles thick. But around 11,700 years ago, something changed. The climate warmed. The ice began to retreat. And the world transformed. In Africa, the ending of the Ice Age meant something different. The Sahara, which for millennia had been a grassland dotted with lakes and rivers, was about to begin its long transformation into the desert we know today. But in 800 BCE, that transition was just beginning. Much of East Africa was wetter, greener, more hospitable than it is now. Lake Turkana was larger then. Its shores teemed with life. Fish crowded the shallows. Hippos wallowed in the reeds. Birds migrated here by the thousands, turning the sky black with their numbers. And along those shores, human beings lived in small, mobile groups, following the seasonal patterns of game and edible plants. These were hunter-gatherers. They didn't farm. They didn't keep livestock. They didn't build permanent villages or establish territorial boundaries marked by walls or fences. They moved with the resources, never staying in one place long enough to exhaust the local food supply. Anthropologists call this a nomadic lifestyle, and it's how humans lived for the vast majority of our existence as a species. Now here's where the story gets interesting. For most of the 20th century, anthropologists and archaeologists operated under a particular assumption about these prehistoric hunter-gatherers. They believed these people were fundamentally peaceful. Not because they were morally superior, but because they had no reason to fight. They didn't own land. They didn't accumulate wealth. They didn't have hierarchies or kings or slaves. They lived in small, egalitarian bands where resources were shared and conflicts were resolved through talking, not bloodshed. This idea became known as the peaceful past hypothesis. It was championed by scholars like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who famously wrote about the noble savage uncorrupted by civilization. It was reinforced by 20th-century anthropologists who studied contemporary hunter-gatherer societies and found them to be remarkably nonviolent compared to agricultural or industrial societies. The logic seemed sound. War, they argued, is a product of civilization. It requires surplus resources to feed standing armies. It requires leaders with the authority to command others into battle. It requires populations dense enough that conflicts over territory become inevitable. Remove those conditions, remove agriculture, remove cities, remove property, and you remove war itself. This wasn't just academic theory. It became cultural dogma. It shaped how we thought about ourselves. It gave us a narrative. Once upon a time, humans lived in harmony with nature and each other. Then came agriculture, and property, and hierarchy, and suddenly we were killing each other in organized, systematic ways. Civilization, in other words, was humanity's original sin. But Nataruk tells a different story. A much darker story. When Marta Mirazan-Lar and her team began excavating at Nataruk, they quickly realized they weren't dealing with a typical burial site. The bodies hadn't been carefully interred. There were no grave goods, no signs of ritual. These people had simply been left where they fell. The first skeleton they uncovered was a male, lying face down in the sediment. His skull showed clear signs of blunt force trauma. Multiple impacts, delivered with enough force to shatter bone. As they continued excavating, they found more. Another male, his skull crushed from behind. A woman, her hands apparently bound at the time of death based on the position of her arm bones. Another woman, heavily pregnant, her fetal skeleton still visible within her pelvic cavity. Over the course of the excavation, they would find 27 individuals in total. 12 were relatively complete skeletons. The others were partial remains, scattered by scavengers or erosion over the millennia. But even with incomplete remains, the evidence was unmistakable. At least 10 of the individuals showed signs of extreme violence. Fractured skulls. Broken ribs. Sharp force trauma consistent with projectile weapons like arrows or spears. One individual had an obsidian blade still embedded in their skull. Another had a crushed spine, the vertebrae shattered by a massive blow. The positions of the bodies told their own story. Several were lying face down, hands behind their backs, as if they'd been bound and executed. Others were sprawled in positions suggesting they'd been running, cut down mid-flight. One skeleton belonged to a man whose knees showed signs of having been crushed or broken, rendering him immobile before he was killed. This wasn't combat. This was slaughter. And it happened 10,000 years ago. Long before the first cities. Long before the invention of agriculture. Long before anything we would recognize as civilization. Let's pause here and think about who these people were. Not as skeletons, not as archaeological specimens, but as human beings. They were hunter-gatherers, part of a small band that moved along the shores of Lake Turkana following seasonal resources. They would have known this landscape intimately. Every water source, every stand of fruit trees, every animal migration route. This was their home in the deepest sense of the word. The group included men, women, and children. The youngest victim was probably around 5 years old. The oldest might have been in their 40s, which would have made them an elder by the standards of the time. Several of the women were of childbearing age. At least one was pregnant, perhaps 8 or 9 months along, close to giving birth. They would have lived in temporary shelters made from branches and animal hides. They would have used stone tools to butcher game and process plant materials. They would have known how to make fire, how to read the stars, how to predict the rains. They would have had language, stories, songs. They would have had names for each other, relationships, histories. They were fully human in every sense. They laughed. They grieved. They loved. They feared. And on one particular day, around 8000 BCE, they were attacked. We don't know the exact circumstances. We don't know if they saw it coming. But based on the evidence, we can piece together a likely scenario. They were by the lake, perhaps fishing or gathering water. The attack came suddenly. Multiple attackers, armed with clubs, spears, and bows. The victims tried to run. Some were cut down immediately. Others were caught, bound, and killed where they knelt. The violence was systematic and thorough. This wasn't a brief skirmish or a moment of hot temper. This was organized. Planned. The attackers wanted to ensure that no one survived. And here's what haunts me about this: the attackers were almost certainly human. Not a different species, not some rival hominid group. Just other humans. Other hunter-gatherers, probably from a neighboring band, who decided for reasons we'll never fully understand that these 27 people needed to die. The discovery of Nataruk immediately raised uncomfortable questions. Questions that reached far beyond archaeology and into the realm of philosophy, ethics, and human nature itself. First, why would hunter-gatherers engage in this level of violence? They didn't have land to defend. They didn't have wealth to steal. They couldn't hold territory because they were nomadic. So what was the motive? Second, if this level of violence existed before civilization, what does that say about the peaceful past hypothesis? Were anthropologists wrong? Had we been telling ourselves a comforting lie about who we used to be? Third, if warfare predates civilization, does that mean violence is innate to humanity? Are we, at our core, a violent species? And if so, what hope is there for peace? These aren't easy questions. And the answers, as we'll see, are complicated. But before we dive into interpretation, we need to understand just how rare and significant this discovery is. Because Nataruk isn't the only evidence of prehistoric violence, but it is the most dramatic and the most conclusive. Archaeologists have long known that violence existed in prehistory. Skeletons with healed fractures, indicating injuries sustained and recovered from. Occasional burials showing fatal wounds. But these were isolated cases, easily explained as accidents, interpersonal disputes, or encounters with predators. What archaeologists hadn't found, until Nataruk, was evidence of large-scale, organized violence. Evidence of warfare. But Nataruk isn't entirely alone. In the decades before and after its discovery, other sites have emerged that hint at a darker prehistoric past. In Sudan, along the Nile, archaeologists excavated a cemetery dating to around 13,000 years ago. Known as Jebel Sahaba, it contained the remains of 59 individuals. Nearly half showed signs of violent death. Arrow wounds. Crushing blows to the skull. Some bodies had multiple injuries, suggesting they were attacked repeatedly. Unlike Nataruk, Jebel Sahaba was a burial site. The bodies had been carefully interred, suggesting that they were members of a community that cared for them even in death. But the pattern of injuries was unmistakable. These people had been killed in some kind of conflict. In Germany, archaeologists found a 7,000-year-old mass grave containing the remains of over 30 people. Their skeletons showed evidence of blunt force trauma, and their bodies had been dumped unceremoniously into a pit. This was early in the agricultural period, shortly after farming had reached Europe, but it still predates what we would call civilization. In California, a site called Calico yielded skeletons with embedded projectile points dating back thousands of years. In France, a cave contained the remains of individuals bearing the marks of violent death. In Australia, ancient rock art depicts what appear to be battle scenes, warriors with spears facing off against each other. The evidence keeps accumulating. And it paints a picture that many scholars find deeply unsettling. But Nataruk remains unique. It's the oldest clear evidence of a massacre. And it's the most complete snapshot of prehistoric violence we've ever found. When the Nataruk findings were published in the journal Nature in 2016, the response was immediate and polarized. Some scholars saw it as vindication. "See," they said. "We told you. Violence is part of human nature. It's always been with us. The peaceful past was a myth." Others pushed back. They argued that Nataruk was an anomaly, a single event that shouldn't be used to draw sweeping conclusions about all prehistoric societies. They pointed out that out of thousands of hunter-gatherer skeletons excavated worldwide, the vast majority show no signs of violent death. Nataruk, they said, was the exception, not the rule. Still others offered alternative interpretations. Maybe this wasn't warfare at all. Maybe it was a raid, a targeted attack on a specific group for specific reasons. Maybe these victims had violated some taboo, committed some crime that demanded retribution. Maybe this was justice, however brutal, not war. The debate became heated. Papers were published. Conferences were held. Academics argued in journals and lecture halls. Because at stake was more than just the interpretation of a single site. At stake was our entire understanding of who we are as a species. Let me walk you through the main arguments, because they're important. They're not just academic. They touch on questions that affect how we see ourselves today. The first argument goes like this: Nataruk proves that violence is hardwired into human nature. We don't need civilization to make us violent. We don't need agriculture or property or kings. We're violent by default. It's in our DNA. Proponents of this view point to our closest living relatives, chimpanzees. Chimps engage in organized violence. They form coalitions and raid neighboring groups, killing males and sometimes infants. This behavior has been observed in the wild across multiple populations. It's not taught. It's not cultural. It's instinctive. If chimps do it, and we share a common ancestor with chimps, then maybe we inherited the same capacity, even the same drive, for organized violence. Moreover, proponents argue, violence serves an evolutionary purpose. In a world of scarce resources, eliminating competitors means more food, more territory, more reproductive opportunities for your own group. From a purely Darwinian perspective, violence makes sense. It's adaptive. This argument is compelling in its bleakness. It suggests that war isn't a mistake or an aberration. It's a feature, not a bug. And if that's true, then the dream of lasting peace is just that, a dream. Because you can't overcome your own nature. The second argument takes a different approach. It says, yes, humans are capable of violence. But that doesn't mean we're violent by nature. Context matters. Scholars in this camp point out that the Lake Turkana region 10,000 years ago was undergoing dramatic environmental changes. The climate was shifting. The lake was shrinking. Resources that had once been abundant were becoming scarce. In times of scarcity, even normally peaceful groups can turn violent. It's not about nature. It's about desperation. When people are starving, when their children are dying, they'll do things they wouldn't otherwise do. They'll fight for access to water. They'll kill to protect their hunting grounds. Nataruk, these scholars argue, represents a moment of extreme stress. A breakdown of normal social relations caused by environmental collapse. It's not proof that all humans are violent all the time. It's proof that under the right, or wrong, conditions, any group of humans can become violent. This argument is more hopeful. It suggests that violence isn't inevitable. If we create conditions of abundance, if we reduce competition for resources, if we build systems that promote cooperation rather than conflict, we can minimize violence. Maybe even eliminate it. The third argument says, why are we choosing? Humans are complex. We're capable of extraordinary violence and extraordinary compassion. Both are real. Both are part of who we are. This perspective draws on decades of anthropological research. Yes, there's evidence of violence in prehistory. But there's also overwhelming evidence of cooperation. Hunter-gatherers share food. They care for their sick and elderly. They form alliances with neighboring groups through trade and intermarriage. They have elaborate rituals for resolving disputes without bloodshed. The same species that produced the massacre at Nataruk also produced art, music, language, and love. We're not inherently good or inherently evil. We're inherently flexible. We have the capacity for both. And which capacity we express depends on a million different factors: our culture, our environment, our leaders, our choices. This argument is nuanced. It refuses easy answers. And maybe that's appropriate. Because the truth about human nature has never been simple. But let's return to the specific question of Nataruk. Why did it happen? What drove one group of humans to annihilate another? We'll never know for certain. The attackers left no written records. The victims can't speak. But we can speculate, based on what we know about human behavior and prehistoric conditions. One possibility: resources. Around 8000 BCE, the climate in East Africa was changing. The wet period that had followed the Ice Age was beginning to end. Lakes were shrinking. Game was becoming less abundant. Groups that had previously coexisted peacefully might have found themselves competing for the same dwindling resources. If the Nataruk group controlled access to a particularly valuable stretch of shoreline, or a reliable fishing spot, or a grove of fruit trees, that might have been enough to provoke an attack. Not a simple raid to steal food, but a deliberate attempt to eliminate competitors entirely. Another possibility: revenge. Maybe there had been an earlier conflict, an earlier death, that demanded retribution. Many hunter-gatherer societies have elaborate codes of honor that require blood to be answered with blood. If someone from the Nataruk group had killed someone from the attacking group, the attack might have been retaliation. A third possibility: territoriality. Maybe by 800 BCE, groups in this region were becoming less nomadic, staying in one area for longer periods. If the Nataruk group was seen as encroaching on another group's territory, that might have been justification enough for violence. A fourth possibility, and perhaps the darkest: maybe there was no rational motive. Maybe it was simply hatred. Fear. The sense that the other group was different, dangerous, less than human. We see this throughout recorded history. Groups defining themselves in opposition to others. Dehumanizing outsiders. And once you've convinced yourself that they're not really people, it becomes easier to kill them. Or maybe it was a combination of all these factors. Resource stress creating tension. Territorial disputes escalating. A cycle of violence and revenge spiraling out of control. And then, one day, an attack that crossed a line. An attack intended not to intimidate or punish, but to exterminate. Let's talk about how it happened. Because the evidence from Nataruk tells us something about the sophistication of prehistoric violence. The attackers used multiple types of weapons. Clubs or heavy sticks capable of crushing skulls. Spears or arrows with stone points. One victim had an obsidian blade embedded in their skull. Obsidian, a volcanic glass sharper than modern surgical steel. This wasn't improvised violence. This was planned. The attackers brought weapons. They coordinated. They attacked from multiple directions, cutting off escape routes. Some victims showed signs of having been bound. Their hands were behind their backs, their arm bones positioned in ways that suggest ligatures. This means the attackers brought rope or cord. They intended to take prisoners. Or perhaps they bound victims to make execution easier. The level of organization required for this kind of attack is significant. It suggests leadership. Someone had to plan it. Someone had to convince others to participate. Someone had to coordinate the assault. And this is what makes Nataruk so chilling. We're not talking about a sudden burst of rage, a fight that got out of hand. We're talking about premeditated, organized, large-scale violence. We're talking about warfare. After the killing stopped, the attackers left. They didn't bury the bodies. They didn't take anything that we can identify archaeologically. They simply left 27 people dead by the lakeshore. Over the following days and weeks, scavengers would have come. Hyenas, vultures, jackals. The bodies would have been torn apart, scattered. Bones would have been dragged away. Eventually, the lake rose or sediment washed over the site, covering what remained. For 10,000 years, the bones lay undisturbed. Generations came and went. Entire civilizations rose and fell. Egypt built its pyramids. Rome conquered the Mediterranean. The Industrial Revolution transformed the world. And all the while, the evidence of this ancient massacre lay waiting in the sediment by Lake Turkana. When we talk about history, we usually mean written history. The period for which we have texts, inscriptions, records. That history goes back about 5,000 years, to the first writing systems in Mesopotamia and Egypt. But human history is so much longer than that. Anatomically modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years. For 99% of that time, we were hunter-gatherers. And for 99% of that time, we left no written records. The only evidence we have of their lives comes from archaeology. From the objects they made, the shelters they built, the bones they left behind. Nataruk gives us a rare and terrible window into that prehistoric world. It shows us something that no text could ever capture. It shows us violence in its rawest form, preserved in bone and stone. Since the discovery of Nataruk, archaeologists have looked at other sites with fresh eyes. They've re-examined skeletons that were excavated decades ago and stored in museum basements. They've applied new technologies, CT scans, isotope analysis, DNA testing, to old evidence. And a pattern is emerging. Violence was more common in prehistory than we thought. Not universal. Not constant. But present. A recurring feature of human life even before agriculture, before cities, before civilization. In Europe, as farming spread from the Middle East starting around 9,000 years ago, there's evidence of violence increasing. Fortified settlements appear, suggesting people feared attack. Mass graves turn up, containing dozens of bodies showing signs of violent death. One of the most striking examples is the Talheim death pit in Germany, dating to about 7,000 years ago. 34 people, buried in a single grave. Men, women, children. Most killed by blows to the head from stone axes. This was one of the first farming communities in Central Europe, and they were massacred. Another example, the Neolithic site of Asparen/Schletz in Austria, where the remains of over 200 people were found in a defensive ditch. They'd been killed and their bodies thrown into the ditch like refuse. This was around 7,000 years ago, early in the agricultural transition. The pattern suggests that as humans began settling down, as they began accumulating resources and defending territory, violence increased. But Nataruk shows us that the violence didn't start with agriculture. It was already there, lurking in the human repertoire of behaviors, ready to emerge under the right conditions. So where does this leave us? If violence is part of human nature, if it predates civilization, if it's been with us for thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, what hope is there? Let me offer a perspective that I think gets lost in the debates. Yes, violence is part of human nature. But so is cooperation. So is empathy. So is the capacity for self-sacrifice, for art, for love. The question isn't whether we're violent or peaceful. The question is, under what conditions does each tendency emerge? Because here's what we also know from anthropology, the vast majority of hunter-gatherer societies, both prehistoric and contemporary, are remarkably egalitarian and non-violent within their own groups. They share resources. They resolve conflicts through talking. They have strong social norms against violence. Between groups, it's more complicated. Sometimes there's conflict. Sometimes there's cooperation. Sometimes there's a mix. But even in cases of intergroup violence, it's rarely constant. It's episodic. Something triggers it: resource scarcity, a specific conflict, a leader pushing for war. And we also know this, as societies become more complex, as they develop institutions for managing conflict, as they create systems of justice and mechanisms for cooperation, violence tends to decrease. Not always. Not linearly. But overall, statistically, large-scale organized societies are less violent per capita than small-scale societies. This might seem counterintuitive. After all, modern states wage wars that kill millions. But on a per capita basis, a higher percentage of people in small-scale societies die from violence than in large-scale societies. This is the argument made by scholars like Steven Pinker in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Pinker's work is controversial, and there are legitimate critiques of his methodology. But the basic point stands: we're not doomed by our nature. We're not slaves to our violent impulses. We can create conditions that minimize violence. We can build societies that channel our competitive energies into peaceful outlets. We can choose cooperation over conflict. Nataruk doesn't prove that we're inherently violent. It proves that we're capable of violence. There's a difference. Before we move toward the conclusion, I want to return to something I mentioned earlier. The victims at Nataruk weren't statistics. They were people. Let's think about them as individuals, just for a moment. There was a child, maybe 5 years old. A little boy or girl who would have been just learning the skills needed to survive. Learning to recognize edible plants. Learning to track animals. Learning the stories of their people. That child had parents. Grandparents. Friends. A whole life ahead of them. There was a pregnant woman, days or weeks away from giving birth. She was carrying new life. Maybe she already had other children. Maybe this was her first. She would have felt the baby moving inside her. She would have been preparing, gathering soft skins to wrap the infant in, thinking about names. There was an older man, his bones showing signs of arthritis and healed injuries from a life lived hard. He would have been a repository of knowledge. He would have known things that no one else knew: where to find water in the dry season, how to read the behavior of animals, the history of the group stretching back generations. Each of them had an inner life as rich and complex as yours or mine. They had hopes. They had fears. They had memories. They had people they loved and people who loved them. And in a few moments of horrific violence, all of that was erased. This is what violence does. It doesn't just end lives. It destroys entire worlds. Every person is a world, a universe of experience and relationship and possibility. And when that person is killed, that entire universe vanishes. The massacre at Nataruk happened 10,000 years ago. But it echoes through the ages. We see it in the Bronze Age, when cities began to appear and with them, organized armies. We see it in the Iron Age, when empires rose and fell through conquest. We see it in the ancient world, the Assyrians, known for their brutal military campaigns. The Romans, building an empire on the backs of legions. The Mongols, sweeping across Asia and Europe. We see it in more recent history. The 30 Years' War that devastated Europe in the 17th century. The Napoleonic Wars. The American Civil War. The World Wars of the 20th century, which killed tens of millions. We see it today, in conflicts around the world. Different weapons, different technologies, different justifications. But the same fundamental dynamic. Groups of humans deciding that other groups of humans must die. The details change. The scale changes. But the pattern remains. And yet, we also see something else. We see the gradual, halting, inconsistent development of systems to prevent or limit violence. Laws. Treaties. International organizations. Norms against warfare, against genocide, against atrocity. We see individuals who choose peace even when violence would be easier. We see communities that refuse to give in to hatred. We see nations that resolve their conflicts through negotiation rather than war. We're not slaves to our history. We're not bound to repeat the patterns of the past. We have the capacity to learn, to change, to choose differently. But we can't make those choices if we don't understand what we're dealing with. And that's why Nataruk matters. Not because it proves we're doomed. But because it shows us what we're capable of. And in knowing that, we can guard against it. There's a question that philosophers have debated for millennia: is human nature fundamentally good or fundamentally evil? Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century English philosopher, believed that humans in a state of nature were brutish and violent. Without the restraining force of government and law, he argued, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Civilization, in his view, was what saved us from our own worst impulses. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing a century later, took the opposite view. He believed that humans in a state of nature were innocent and good. It was civilization, with its property, its hierarchies, its corrupting influences, that made us violent and cruel. For most of the 20th century, anthropology sided with Rousseau. The evidence seemed to support the idea of the peaceful past. Hunter-gatherers, we were told, were egalitarian and cooperative. Violence was a product of civilization, not nature. Nataruk challenges that narrative. It suggests that Hobbes might have been closer to the truth. That violence isn't something civilization created. It's something civilization tries to control. But I don't think we have to choose between Hobbes and Rousseau. I think they were both right. And both wrong. Humans are neither inherently good nor inherently evil. We're inherently flexible. We're shaped by our environments, our cultures, our choices. We have the capacity for incredible cruelty and incredible kindness. Both are real. Both are human. The tragedy of Nataruk is that it shows us the capacity for cruelty. But the miracle of human history is that it also shows us the capacity for transcendence. For building societies that channel our energies toward creation rather than destruction. For developing moral frameworks that say, this is wrong, this must not be done. There's so much we'll never know about Nataruk. We don't know the names of the victims. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know their language, their stories, their songs. We don't know the names of the attackers either. We don't know what drove them to do what they did. We don't know if they felt remorse afterward, or triumph, or nothing at all. We don't know if this was an isolated event or part of a longer conflict. We don't know if the attackers were themselves attacked later, if the cycle of violence continued. We don't know if anyone survived to carry the story forward, or if the entire history of this event died with the victims. All we have are the bones. Silent witnesses to an act of violence that echoes across 10,000 years. In some ways, that silence is fitting. Because it forces us to confront the event on its own terms, without the softening filter of narrative or justification. We can't explain it away. We can't say, oh, but they had a good reason. We don't know if they had a good reason. We just know they did it. And maybe that's the lesson. Maybe the point isn't to understand why. Maybe the point is to acknowledge that it happened. That it can happen. That under the right circumstances, it might happen again. Unless we choose otherwise. So what does Nataruk prove about who we really are? It proves that we're capable of terrible things. That violence is part of our behavioral repertoire. That we don't need civilization to make us cruel. But it also proves something else. Something we often forget. We're here. 10,000 years after Nataruk, humanity is still here. We survived. We thrived. Despite our capacity for violence, despite all the wars and massacres and atrocities throughout history, we've built civilizations. We've created art and literature and music. We've developed science and medicine. We've sent people to the moon and machines to the edge of the solar system. The same species that produced the massacre at Nataruk also produced Beethoven's symphonies. The same hands that can crush a skull can also paint the Sistine Chapel. The same minds that plan violence can also discover the structure of DNA. We contain multitudes. We're capable of the worst and the best. And which capacity we express is not predetermined. It's chosen. Every day, in a million small and large ways, we choose. The bones at Nataruk remind us of what happens when we choose violence. They remind us of the cost. 27 people. 27 worlds. Gone in an afternoon of rage and fear. But they also remind us that we have the power to choose differently. That we're not bound by our nature. That we can build societies that minimize violence, that channel our competitive energies into peaceful pursuits, that protect the vulnerable and restrain the powerful. It's not easy. It never has been. The history of civilization is a history of struggle, between our violent impulses and our cooperative ones, between our selfishness and our empathy, between our capacity to destroy and our capacity to create. But the struggle is worth it. Because on the other side of that struggle is something worth fighting for. Not a perfect world, perfection is not human. But a better world. A world where massacres like Nataruk are not forgotten, but learned from. A world where we remember the cost of violence and choose, as much as we can, as often as we can, to pay that cost no more. The massacre before civilization doesn't prove that we're doomed. It proves that we have a choice. And it reminds us, in the starkest possible terms, why that choice matters. The bones at Nataruk have been silent for 10,000 years. But they speak to us still. They tell us who we've been. Who we can be. Who we must strive not to be. They tell us that history is watching. That our choices echo through time. That violence leaves marks not just on bones, but on the soul of humanity itself. And they ask us, across the gulf of 10 millennia, the same question we must ask ourselves today. What will we choose? What kind of people will we be? What legacy will we leave for the generations that come after us? The answer is not written in our genes. It's not predetermined by our nature. It's written in our actions. In the decisions we make, the systems we build, the values we uphold. Nataruk shows us the darkness we're capable of. But it's up to us to create the light. That's what it proves about who we really are. We're not monsters. We're not angels. We're human. And that means the future is unwritten. The story isn't over. The choice is ours.